The next session is titled The Language of Grief, where we have a panelist of authors who are going to discuss their writings and experiences which deal with the various forms of loss, grief, separation, anxieties of life. I'll briefly introduce each of the panelists and then we can hand over the stage to the speakers. We have A.T. Boyle. For A.T. Boyle, pandemic lockdowns have inspired a children's book collaboration and new fiction for adults. Her writing has been shortlisted by BBC Radio 4 and Miss Lexia, and her projects include a Turkish-English book, performance, community events, and a textile exhibition. A.T. Boyle worked for 5 years with international awards for creative tech before returning to her birthplace in Northern England to be closer to her parents. The recent deaths, one from COVID-19, have caused her to reflect on loss. Thank you for joining us, A.T. Boyle. We have Nandini Murali, who is present with us in person. Dr. Nandini Murali is Vice President, Learning and Research at Avtar Group, Chennai. She's an author of 5 books, a translator, a certified life coach, and works in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Nandini's latest book, Left Behind: Surviving Suicide Loss, is based on her lived experience of suicide loss, having lost her husband to suicide. Thank you, Nandini, for joining us. We also have Stutee Ghosh. Stutee is an award-winning RJ and presently is with RJ 104 FM, where she hosts the morning show. Mera Wala Grief is a podcast that was born out of Stutee's own personal loss, realizing that grief and loss have a language that's unique to one's own lived experience. She tries to offer a safe space to those dealing with similar pain through this podcast. Welcome, Stutee. Thank you for joining us. These ladies will be in conversation with Dipti Nair. Dipti is an award-winning journalist and has a rich career as a cross-media storyteller. Over to you, ladies.
Thank you. Grief is a Mouse by Emily Dickinson. I just came across this poem a while ago. It explores a range of metaphors for grief, including the idea of grief as a mouse, which chooses wainscot in the breast for his shy house. The idea is that grief is deeply felt, but hidden away, like a mouse in the wainscot. We are aware of it continually, but we never or seldom see it. But the pandemic has put us all in the same universal room of loss and grief. There is nowhere to hide. We carry our grief sometimes cloaked in a smile, sometimes in anxiety, and in other times retreating into our emotional shell, yet not quite being able to grapple with it. All of us are looking at each other to find that elusive language to express the heaviness we feel in our chests. We need the comfort of words to grieve. It is my honor to be moderating this conversation, The Language of Grief, which is an attempt to articulate and understand the expressions of the bereaved. I'm happy to be joined by Nandini Murali here with me, and Stutee and A.T. Boyle from Delhi and from the UK. Nice meeting all of you again. I'll start with you, Stutee. You started the podcast Mera Wala Grief, and that has how has that expression helped you cope with the grief and the tragedy that happened to you?
Thank you so much for inviting me for this. I lost my father on 8th May this year. And it was traumatic, very painful, the kind of pain I had never experienced in my life so far. But there was also this very urgent need to, as they say, get back on track. I'm the only child. I was here with my mom. I had to get back to work. I had to process all this grief. This was also the time when the second wave was at its peak, so you couldn't really meet people, you couldn't really go out. And the only way I could have any semblance of normalcy was if I drowned myself in work. But my work, as you know, is primarily I host the morning show for Fever 104 FM Delhi, and which means I'm supposed to be happy and chirpy, and the city wakes up with me. And yet I didn't have it in me for the first time to to spread any smile or any joy. I wanted to speak about this feeling that was stirring me up, which was just making it so difficult to go off to sleep or get up early in the morning, which is why I started with this podcast. Also, because this was a time, and I'm sure in the course of this discussion we're going to talk about it. You feel like not many people understand you. You feel alienated because only those who've experienced this pain, who've lost someone close to them, actually managed to reach out to me. So even my well-meaning friends, when they would send me texts saying, stay strong, I didn't know what to make of it. And I realized even people I wasn't close to who had gone through something similar knew exactly the thing to say that somehow for that moment consoled me or reached out to me. And it was through all this that Mera Wala Grief was born. The name is my pain. It might be my pain, my grief, but it's also universal. We're all here connected. The feeling that's forged a bond between all of us, and we haven't even met physically, is this feeling. And so it was a series of conversations that I had with people who had lost their close ones. And I didn't, I never done something like this. In media, you talk about views and reach and what people like. This was not something happy. So it wasn't like I was expecting some praise, or I was expecting any, I don't know what I was expecting, but the response has been phenomenal. And that's when you realize that you're not alone. It's not just Mera Wala Grief. Everyone is there's these little islands that people are living in, and they want words, or they want others to share their stories that will make them feel like they're expressing themselves, or make them feel heard, or that their grief exists. And that was what Mera Wala Grief is all about.
Yeah, we'll come to more on that as we go along. Alison, you shared with us earlier, right, that your writing about loss began the moment you heard of your mother's death, and it turned into a eulogy that you spoke at a funeral, and then an obituary for other lives section of The Guardian. Same pattern followed for your father. How did the writing help you make peace with the situation?
Very similar to the Stutee, that you mentioned there, Stutee, this urgency to speak and to facilitate other people, having a platform for others to speak. And I was very compelled to write. So the first moment I rang the hospital ward where my mum had been for a few weeks, and she caught COVID there. And she died on her own without anybody there. And I phoned the hospital. And the moment I put the phone down, I opened my computer and I started writing. It was a stream of consciousness. It was a conduit for my emotions. And it gave me a sort of feeling of control, as much as you can in those first moments. I didn't know what would, it wasn't for any purpose other than to express myself to myself. And I loved the analogy of the Emily Dickinson poem that you mentioned, Dipti, because that led me to, in the process of dealing with the facts of my parents' lives, because my dad died a few months later in a care home, again with some very limited contact with him, holding his hand through blue latex gloves, whereas before, the warmth of his flesh would have been the thing that I would have felt. I was sorting their possessions out in their now empty house, beyond the objects that they'd left and that they no longer needed. And I found some things that I recognised from my childhood and from my adulthood, but I found other things that I didn't know about. And I mean, I've just got one of them here, which is an old Marks and Spencer's bag with the old logo there. And inside it, I found things that had been on their wedding cake, which at the time I discovered them was 66 years before that. And these things are beautifully preserved, including a tiny, tiny little icing sugar dove. It still has its beak. It's well preserved, and I think the journey that I've gone on since then is thinking about these objects, but then they become sort of less important. You know, the things that are important are the ways that my emotions are helping me with my mind, you know, to interpret them and the relationship. And I also am discovering new things, you know, little secrets, little different ways of looking at their lives. And I've, out of that, being very hopeful, you know, moving into that realm of the imagination, which for me is writing and imagery, but it could be also sound, as Stutee was referring to.
We'll come back to the point of you starting a project, X Objects, and about the memory of sort of a memory keeper, right? Nandini, in the COVID, like I've heard a lot of people say when they lost their loved ones, it didn't feel right in the sense of they couldn't even see their loved ones, right? It was everybody's like that closure, that I couldn't get that closure. I couldn't see the body. I couldn't see. I'm sure there is that kind of grief, but there is another kind of grief which you articulated so well the other day. It's disenfranchised grief. And the book that you write is Surviving Suicide. That's a disenfranchised grief, right? If you could talk a little bit about that and how the book came about.
Thank you. Thank you, Dipti, for this question. And thank you, BLF, for having me here today. I'd just like to begin by setting a little context about loss and grief. Loss and grief are very, very universal experiences. I won't even say they're universal human experiences, because there are certain species of animals like elephants, which also grieve. Probably what they don't have is the ability, the language to express their grief. And I think grief is more about loss than about death, you know, because there are other kinds of grief due to non-death losses as well. So with that, to me, grief is a complex medley of emotions, feelings, thoughts. When in this case, I'll stick to my example, when I lost my husband. It's you're searching for a limb that was there, and now that's become a phantom limb, and you just keep, searching for that. That's how it feels like. I would also like to distinguish between grief, which is a combination of emotions, thoughts, and feelings, and grieving, which is the process. And I think this takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. And for me, grief is a very visceral, very embodied experience. Most people tend to think that grieving happens in the mind, but I think it happens in the body. It is located at multiple sites in the body. And I think the Emily Dickinson poem that Dipti read out in the beginning really evokes this very beautifully. So before my husband died, I've witnessed other kinds of deaths in the family, deaths due to illnesses, deaths due to aging-related causes. And what struck me then was so much of empathy, so much of support, so much of collective hand-holding from family and friends to help the bereaved person tide over the loss, to deal with the loss, to come to terms with the loss, to reach acceptance. In fact, the word bereavement itself means bereaved is to be ripped apart. So when we lose someone, especially when someone dies, our lives are literally and metaphorically ripped apart. So now when I come to suicide grief, I didn't know anything about suicide grief or suicide until it happened to me. Until it happened to me, it was something that would happen only to other people, to other families, not in my family. I would read about it in the media, usually sensationalized. So there was, and I remember when I was in school, my best friend's father died of a suicide. I'm not using the word committed suicide because committed places it in the context of sin and crime. So he died of a suicide. And I still remember my friend's family was very unwilling to talk about it. Everybody knew. It was like the elephant in the room that nobody wanted to see, or they pretended it was not there, but the elephant was there. And it was all so hush hush. And then, of course, when I lost my husband, what struck me was instantly there was this sense of shame. There was the sense of guilt. I felt so embarrassed because the first thing that came up to me was, oh my God, what will I tell others? What will the family think of me? What will our friends think of me? What will his colleagues, my colleagues think of me? And my husband was a very well-known doctor in Madurai. So here again, this was the elephant in the room, and I really desperately wanted to whitewash it, wanted to erase it, wanted to minimize it. But I must also tell you, in my professional space, I work a lot with people from marginalized communities, people who face various forms of oppression. So stigma wasn't anything new to me. But I then realized that until then, my understanding of stigma was very cognitive. But when it happened to me, when this was a very stigmatized form of death, I realized that even my need to hide the cause of the death, I wanted to invent socially acceptable reasons for the way my husband died. I wanted to tell people, oh, he died in sleep, or he died of a heart attack, because, that was socially acceptable. But I didn't want to tell people he died of a suicide. But later I realized that this was because the grief itself was disenfranchised. It's a long word, but it's an extremely powerful word. It just means I don't have the right to grieve. Grief is not a very equitable area. Some kinds of grief are considered very normative. So when some people die of those socially acceptable reasons, there's a lot of support, there's a lot of hand-holding, there's a lot of empathy. But for those of us who lose our loved ones, say to suicide, with this so much of stigma, so much of shame, so much of secrecy, so much of silence around it, we don't get the kind of support we need. I say this because grieving is, while it is very individual, it is also very collective. We need a community to grieve around us. In India, in most communities, you'll find elaborate mourning rituals. Mourning is an outward expression of grief. There is a certain mourning period, there's certain mourning rituals. And these rituals, I realized, have been designed to help the bereaved transition to a life where the loved one is absent, is no longer there. So when a grief is disenfranchised, like suicide grief, people impacted, people affected, people bereaved feel very ashamed. They want to just push it under the carpet. As a result, what happens is that it's very isolating. It's profoundly alienating. You really don't know what is happening. So that's the situation I found myself in. But at the same time, I think within a few hours after the tragedy happened, I decided that I needed to be the change I wanted to see. There was no point, taking refuge that, oh, this is shameful, so what will I do? I said, come what may. I didn't do an opinion poll in the family. I didn't ask them, would I be able to, is it okay for me to say this? Something told me that I needed to address this heads on. I didn't know what I would do, but what I know best is writing. And that's how my book, Left Behind, Surviving Suicide Loss, came about. While writing this book, I wanted provide a counter narrative to the prevailing narrative of suicide, shrouded in stigma, shame, secrecy, and silence. So I'd like to believe that my writing was an act of transgression. It was subverting dominant stereotypes. It was telling people, look, this is the elephant in the room, and it's time we saw it, and it's time we decided what could we as a society do to address this problem. Suicide is a huge public health challenge, not only in India, but across the world. And as someone with a lived experience of suicide loss, as someone who has lost a loved one to suicide, I felt that people like us are a very important stakeholder in addressing this challenge head on.
I applaud you, Nandini. That was also an act of bravery. The book is available at the bookshop, and you can pick it up there. And the fact that you talked about community, you talked about we need a community. Coming to you, Stutee, the fact that you started this and the fact that you spoke to other people, it was also in a sense trying to get that community together, right, of like-minded people, because when we were talking earlier, you did mention that what you were talking about and what you expected to hear from other people, the languages that was used, the phrases that were used, that like, okay, this too shall pass, become okay, that's fine, he was old, and things like that, right? Could you tell us a little bit about that? How did you find that sucker in this whole community that you built through your Mera Wala Grief?
Anyone, the phrases that you use, stay strong, or asking the person's age and saying, oh, but he lived his life and things like that. Nobody who's actually gone through pain would ever say something like this. And for me at that time, and even now, I mean, I'm still grieving. I'm very, very sensitive to a few things. Even now, the world is divided for me between those who understand, who speak to me in a language of grief, and who understand and respect that, and those who, not for any fault of theirs, but are oblivious to it. They don't understand what effect their actions or words can have on people who are grieving and coping with the loss of a loved one. Mera Wala Grief led me to speak to celebrities who otherwise we always think have it together, who we think know, or probably get over these things quicker, but that's not the case. I spoke to Swastika, who had lost both her parents, Barkha Dutt, who had lost both her parents, Hansal Mehta, who was still trying to understand, he was still coping with the death of his mother when his father passed away. And a lot of lived experience, a lot of what they said about not being able to probably look at their books or the stuff of their parents, or to not be able to sometimes even speak. Every person copes with it differently. Some want to reach out and speak. Like I was one of those who wanted to speak, who wanted to let out, because that's the only way I can process it myself. There are a lot of people who don't like to talk about it. For them, shutting it, pushing it back helps. So not only did it help us, me and my guest in every episode, to express what we felt, and we realized that even though we had not met, we were in different age and stage in our lives, our feelings were very similar. What we felt was very similar. I'm also completely overwhelmed with the response that I've got, because, like I said, with my film reviews or with my shows, it's all happy and nice. And you have people saying, oh, I really enjoyed this. I had a good laugh, or that was fun. I never really thought, for some reason, that people would even listen to this. I didn't expect anyone to really tune into Mera Wala Grief and want to hear about loss, about somebody speaking about their father who they don't know about. And yet I was so overwhelmed and humbled with the love I got with complete strangers. And this was a listenership that was very new to me. People I had never met, I probably will not, who opened up, who would write me long messages. either send emails or DM me, telling me about their parents, how they coped with it. And particularly in this year, those of us who've lost loved ones, I think the COVID second wave, there's no family in this country that's managed to remain completely untouched. You've lost colleagues, friends, family, neighbors. And it's been particularly traumatic because, like Nandini ji was saying, generally you have a sense of community. You have people. I have, been born and brought up in Delhi. My parents have been here. Had it not been for COVID, there would have been more people around. You have these rituals. You have 14-day mourning period. You have a das. You have prayer meetings. You have people who are hand-holding you through this. And I'm sorry, even now I find it very difficult to speak about how, for me, somewhere I've left a part of myself in that hospital corridor, because that's where I received the news, and that is where I completely blanked out. I didn't know, and I had to act. I had to act because there were practical problems. If you don't take him away immediately, they'll put him in the morgue. I had to get a non-COVID certificate. I didn't know who to call. I didn't know what to do. So there were all these things, and there was no one. So although at the end of it, we all know that it is your own personal grief and you have to cope with it. But it was also particularly traumatic because for a lot of families, you couldn't give your loved ones the send-off that you wanted to. That was very, very, I think, very painful for a lot of people. Also because of which, I think we haven't got that closure. I now understand the symbolic meaning of why you have prayer meetings, or why people come over, or why, a condolence message is important. It is important because the person who's grieving sometimes wants to reach out, and it's good to know there are people around. So literally and metaphorically, at that time, a lot of families were forced to be alone and to cope with all of it alone. Which was very painful, and that's why I think I can never still associate the word happy with the response that I've got for my podcast, because I just wish that all of us heal, and we don't have to go through this ever again. But just the fact that it reached out, that people felt like it was speaking to them, I think that means a lot to me. And that is what we wanted to do, because a lot of people even now feel, forget about what the government is saying, but people genuinely feel like they're not being heard or seen, or their grief doesn't exist for a lot of people. And it's important for them to feel like somebody is talking to them.
Alice and Stutee talked about, the objects, like some of the stuff that reminds you of your loved ones. And while on the other hand, you have started this project called X Objects, where you are trying to preserve that. You're trying to preserve the memory with objects and of your parents. Talk a little bit about that, and how does that feel to celebrate their life through these objects?
Yeah, I do find there's a lovely correlation with this notion of collective mourning, community, as you were all saying, that connection that we have, it's a universal connection. Everybody has been affected by the pandemic. And there is a specificity about grief and loss. And I found that by looking at particular objects in detail, that they're tangible, but they're also intangible objects that come out of that. So just picking up on what you said there, Stutee, about a hospital corridor, just those two words, for me, take me to a hospital corridor where another of my objects, which is not a, it's not a pillowcase that my mum embroidered. It's a look of a consultant, and it's a look that my mum gave me, which is the last time that I saw her in the same space. And we can, I think, by sharing, if we, as you say, if we feel compelled to, which I think we all have here, you know, through your book, Nandini, through your radio interviews and through the project that I'm doing, Ex Objects, which is a collaborative project. I think we have the chance to look at specific things, and this can take us to different places. You know, we don't necessarily have to have the object at all. It's not necessarily something here it is, I'll show it to you, but it's just something that we are possessed by, you know, that contain emotions, you know, love. It contains memories of misunderstandings you might have had with the person, you know, arguments. And I think that element of honesty is running through all of these projects. And the reason I called my project Ex Objects was I see it as a journey, I suppose, from that moment where I was just writing to, because that was what was the right thing for me to do, to form to get some shape and frame it. Here I am 1 year and 1 week after the death of my mum, and I do find that I am in a different place. And some of those objects, you know, they become ex objects. You know, my parents. I lost them. The word bereaved, as you were referring to, Nandini. You know, they're gone in some ways. I moved into a zone which was thinking about, I can do what I like here. You know, and I thought of X as almost in an equation, in our maths equation. You know, if we can fill in our own answer, we can also decide what that X is. You know, we can populate that zone with, you know, really happy things. There can be sad things, but there can be new things. You know, there can be new understandings of those people and our relationships with them. And we can try and draw out some universals from that. And we can, I think, move into something where we can collaborate with others. So we're putting something out which is very personal, and I normally wouldn't be very personal. I think you made some really good points there, you know, both of them about being out there and doing it for ourselves. It's our motivation, but also inviting others in. And Ex Objects is that. So I've got some writing on artificialsilk.org, which is my website, and I've got a new Twitter handle, which is Ex Objects on Twitter. And I'm going to post some bits of writing, but I'm really hoping that people will contribute in their own way, whether it's through an image or an actual object or a memory, a thought, but being quite creative about it, you know, not necessarily factual. You know, we have our facts, we have our experiences. So it's been, you know, what we can then draw out of that and try and share our understanding.
You know, Nandini, Stutee at one point also talked about closure, and I also mentioned that earlier. And is that the right word? Is that what we are when we say we are seeking closure? What does that mean?
Yeah, I've also been engaged with what this term closure means. And in my grief journey, I found that it was so elusive, you know, what exactly is closure? And then the more I sort of reflected on it, the more I engaged with my own grieving process, I realized that there is no such thing as closure, because the word closure to me, it signifies that something happened, there's a gaping, it's open, and then you close it up and then very neatly package it, put it behind, and you then move on. But when we lose a loved one, whether due to death or due to non-death reasons, even if it's a loss of a relationship, I don't think there is a closure in the true sense of the term. What we probably would mean, I guess what happens is there is a movement towards acceptance, you know, and acceptance, I feel, is a much more, is a less violent word. because it says that you come to acceptance on your terms. There's no timeline, whereas closure implies a very defined timeline, and it's over. And but those of us who've lost our loved ones, we know that there's no closure. Closure implies that they have nothing, they have no more connection in our lives. But I think all of us here who've lost a loved one, in whatever way, we celebrate their lives. Their memories are sacred to us. And for me, when that happens, that is when acceptance happens, which is more a state of grace. Yeah.
I'll open it now for any questions from the audience, and then we can go back to some other questions if there are. Okay, I'll just continue. So, there is this, a lot of poets and writers have described grief as kind of love which has nowhere else to go. I would open it to anybody who wants to take this question. How in your process of your creative process, because it is sort of writing, whether it is talking to other people, and here it is a kind of a creative outlet. How has that helped you cope with it?
Yeah, please. I found I always deal with life's challenges through creative expressions. So this time it was no different, but this was, if I had to measure it on a Richter scale, I think the impact of what struck me was really unmeasurable. But that said, writing the book was very healing, very, very transformative. In the first year, I couldn't write because the overwhelm was too much. And I also realized that one can write only when one is in a state of equanimity. So the first year I had a journal, and the first part of the book is the journal, which morphed into a book. I read a lot around the subject of suicide and suicide grief. In fact, I'd like to believe I'm a self-styled suicidologist. I read up everything on the net, literally scoured the net, and bought and read every book on planet Earth on this subject. That I realized was my way of making meaning. I wanted to understand why, what happened, because there was no one I could turn to. And then there was another book by another survivor of suicide loss, and a journalist who's today a very close friend of mine, Carla Fine. Her book actually pointed the way forward for me. I just loved the resilience, the robustness, and the courage with which she undertook her journey. And so a year later, I started writing. The second year, I think it was possible for me to write. And I'd like to believe that when I wrote, it was from a space of equanimity, joyousness. There was a lightness. And I think that's what I would like my readers to resonate with. You need not have had this experience. You need not have had even a similar experience, but yet when the worst happens, we have choices. It's not the end of the world. And I wanted that note of hope, that note of resilience, that note of optimism, grounded optimism to emerge. And for me, it was all about saying no to victimization and not only surviving, but thriving. So, that was for me, the act of giving birth to all this was very, very healing, was very, very transformative. If I were to put it in a phrase, it was transforming through trauma, very, very mindfully. Very slowly, but that said, I wouldn't say that it was just possible for me to transform like that. It was one step forward and a million steps forward. that's the journey. It seemed like the hero's journey. I had to slay lots of dragons and demons along the way, and so many of those dragons and demons were within me. And I'd like to believe that I'm moving towards that proverbial treasure, which is actually the journey within myself. So in many ways, for me, writing this book was not only deeply transformative, it was also a very spiritual experience.
Do we have time? Yeah. Alice, yes, Alison, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, in slight contrast, I found that writing brought me equanimity. And I was then led to being, to a state which I think I wouldn't have been in so quickly. I felt I was moving through the act of writing and expressing. And that, I love the fact that you were referencing joyousness, and we know that it isn't, constant joy. But one of the things that I also found was that we are exploring ourselves, through our expressions, or whichever way we're approaching it, we are looking at ourselves, and the deeper we look, I think we can then understand our relationship with the people that we've lost, and we make choices. We can't deal with everything. It feels very calamitous at the time. There are all these things raining down on us. But by focusing on a very particular thing, whether it be, a thought that comes into our head, or something that we spot on a shelf which has an association with something, or just a song that comes to mind that person used to sing, these things can help us, I think, to gain equanimity. And I think listening to other people, yes, it really helps to, getting their perspectives on that thing that you are talking about, and so that you can hopefully give them some perspective and positive reactions to the things that they've exposed to you.
You had a passage. Yeah, Stutee, you were saying something, sorry.
No. Alison, are you done?
Yes.
Did I cut you, Alison?
No.
No, I think sometimes it is about taking your broken heart and creating art, right? Although I can talk about Mera Wala Grief, and when I started with it, it was primarily because I thought there weren't enough people who were speaking my language, and my problem was that even though I was a morning show jock, I couldn't tolerate music. I couldn't listen to music, because music was something that my dad really enjoyed, and it would remind me of him. And at that time, I was extremely angry and bitter, and in that zone about why has this happened, and could I have done anything about it? And I only wanted to be with this, and I didn't know what to listen or what to watch. I couldn't read, and I couldn't listen to music. And that was a huge problem for me, which is why I almost created this content so that I could play it back to myself. And the fact that there were others who had gone through something similar, I realized slowly made me less angry. I became, it helped me calm down. It was also extremely draining. I would shoot that episode, and it would be very difficult for me, because hours before I would record, and then for some time after that, you're still talking about that, you're thinking about it. So it was draining. But I realized over a period of time that I stopped being as angry and bitter as I was, and there was this urge in me to actually want to listen, or to in any way try and help someone else. So I would make sure that I read every email I got or every message I got. And not that I'm an expert, not that I'm a therapist, but I'm just somebody who's going through it, and probably today is in a slightly better position, or a little more privileged position, where she can reach out to more people. And that's what I tried to do with this. Also, I think I just felt that Baba was hand-holding me, because he was a very creative person, and he would always say that it is always through art that you even navigate life. So it was in a way also a tribute to him.
Just a short passage. Alison, you had some short passage to read. If you can quickly read that, and Nandini, if you can then read a short passage, just to get the flavor of the book. Yeah, Alison,
Yes,
would you like to?
Yeah, Stutee, and I just wanted to say, Baba was hand holding me. I did feel, and the passage I could read from was my mum was there holding my hand as I looked through her objects, although she was dead. I just write on my website, each object is the nexus of the emotional interactions that bind us to those we love, restoring stories seemingly long dissolved by time. And we can re-establish a sense of possibility of interaction with the person whose role, has changed in your world. So the little piece of writing that I wanted to just read at the end was trying to express my mum to me in a way. Fragile, modest strength persists through a far-reaching signal. I must listen hard because your voice is quite gone. And that's very specifically about the way her voice became very croaky and lost through COVID. I must listen hard because your voice is quite gone. Maybe I can accept what you said, that you lived a happy life, made possible, though you like to chat, because of your huge capacity to hold and not divulge. The footless sugar and water dove, which was on top of this wedding cake, which I found, wasn't made to fly. And the wedding cake foundation is no longer required. What you did through your long lifetime was sufficient. The dove can stay in my wardrobe while it's left for me to decide. And that then relates to another object where, as I say, my mum was there helping me to decide whether the thing I just found in that cupboard was going in the black bin bag or whether it was going to be taken home, and I was going to look after it and find space for it. So it's that curation of objects that belong to them, and now they're in my space and I'm now considering them, but I do feel that I'm not alone when I consider them.
Thank you so much. Nandini?
This is my favorite part of the book. It's towards the end of the book, probably the last chapter. And I felt that this information is for anyone who's this message is for anyone dealing with loss and grief. Say, accept your loss. Your life has changed forever. The loss is irreversible. Your tears, longing, pity, piety, nothing can alter the outcome. Stop asking why me. There are no answers. Instead, ask why not, and ask what next. Take ownership of your life. You and you alone are responsible for your life. Whether you yield or transform, the choice is yours. Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. You had no control over the cause, but you can control the outcome by choosing how to respond. Pick up the pieces after a fall. You have the power and the responsibility to rebuild your life. Be proud of your scars. Your scars are an important part of you. Be like the resilient oyster. Discover the poetry of your being through pearls of grit and grace. Your wisdom is your pain transformed. Be flexible, flow like the water, bend like the reed. Life is waiting to flow through you. Be open to grace.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Stutee, would you like to share something? Otherwise, I think we can open it for audience. Otherwise, I think we should be done. Yeah. Stutee, do you have anything to say?
No, just that was I think I heard both Alison and Nandini ji, and it really touched me, which is what I was saying earlier, that when we speak to people who've gone through something similar, the way they reach you, not many can. And I am so glad that we had this panel and we are speaking about this, because there are so many people who are grieving and who also don't know what to do. Sometimes you're just so blanked out about how to even process it or where to take the first step from. And I think it's extremely comforting to know that there are people who've gone through something similar and they speak that language of loss and grief. And I think that really goes a long way in helping people cope with their individual pain.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Stutee. And thank you so much, Nandini, for joining us. And thank you so much for being here and attending this session.